Here follows an extract from my book Artful Designs, available from Amazon. Chapter 1, Part 1. Beth closed the door after saying goodbye to her last pupil of the evening. She'd been giving piano lessons since the close of school that day, and it was usual for her husband, Drew, to have the kettle boiling ready to make a cup of tea as soon as she'd finished. The kitchen was unusually quiet and no steaming kettle greeted her as she walked through the door. She carried her search on through the kitchen and walked into Drew's art studio looking for signs of life. Maybe he'd got carried away with his work, but no husband was to be found there either. A thorough search of the house was unfruitful and led her to look outside. Adjoining the garage, which was now converted into the art studio, was a large shed which usually housed garden tools, bicycles, and the expected desultory bric-a-brac. A recent bout of spring cleaning meant that it was now relatively empty, but subdued noises could be heard emanating from within the structure. A strange sight met Beth's eyes as she opened the door. Opposite the entrance, two figures stood facing the long interior wall. Both were clad in thin plastic overalls and gloves. Hoods covered their heads and their faces were concealed behind goggles and dust masks. One figure was taller than the other, and the broader back and shoulders hinted at middle age. The shorter apparition was of a slimmer build and moved with the agility of youth. Both were wielding aerosol paint cans. The younger protagonist was dexterously brandishing a can in each hand and was too absorbed in his current occupation to notice the unexpected audience. On hearing the door open, the taller figure turned to face Beth, nodded and extended an upturned palm towards her. It was to be supposed that this was in fact her husband, who was signalling that he'd be with her in about 5 minutes. Beth shook her head and walked back to the kitchen smiling. Setting 3 mugs of tea onto the table, Beth pottered about the kitchen waiting to find out what her husband was up to, although the evidence of her own eyes when she'd opened the shed door made this quite apparent. She wondered who the other mysterious figure was who seemed so adept with spray cans. Beth had met Drew when they were both 18. At that time she was studying for the Oxford Classical Music syllabus, and Drew was part of the art department on the same college campus. Despite the many social taboos that dictated that classical music and fine art students shouldn't mingle, they'd spent long hours chatting next to the vending machine in the shared refectory. He'd introduced himself as Andrew, that being his name, but Beth had quickly named him Drew in reference to his field of expertise. She'd thought it the height of hilarity then, and still smiled even now as she thought of the aptness of the nickname. Beth had retained a love for cheap vending machine coffee ever since then, and in addition to the joint tea breaks that were still an integral part of their working day, they'd sometimes extend their morning break to visit their local motorbike dealership to drool over any new additions to the showroom whilst nursing a plastic cup of automatically vended instant coffee. Crinkling and shuffling soon signalled the approach of the graffiti artists as dust masks were removed and the door into the kitchen opened. Drew was in animated conversation with a young man who looked to be in his late teens. Both men hindered the progress of removing their overalls with much gesticulation to explain particular aspects of their discussion. Beth added a plate of homemade oatmeal cookies next to the mugs of tea, and the 3 of them sat around the ancient pine table. "Beth, let me introduce you to Scott. He's on placement at the Whitworth Art Gallery. This is the young man who keeps me sane while I'm locked away cataloguing paintings in the basement," said Drew. Suddenly all became clear to Beth. Drew was being optimistically polite when he referred to Scott's time at the Whitworth as a placement. From a previous conversation, Beth knew that Scott was completing a period of community service after being prosecuted for vandalism and getting slapped with an ASBO after repeated graffiti offences. The judge had shown an inspired logic and dictated that if Scott was so passionate about art, he should use his time to serve the community in a genre that he obviously had a passion for. If he needed to vent his creativity, then let it be in an appropriate channel. From the reports Drew brought back with him from his days at the museum, The judge's wisdom had proved to be insightful, and Scott was flourishing under the guidance of like-minded, if somewhat more conventional enthusiasts. It was becoming apparent that Scott had a lively intellect and a natural eye for art in many forms, and he was becoming a real asset to the work that was underway at the gallery. The Whitworth was currently closed to the public as it underwent a major refurbishment programme. An awful lot of heavy manual labour was required as priceless works of art had to be lugged into storage. Some of the exhibits were of massive proportions, and the hefty frames required back-breaking efforts to move them to safety as work got underway. Scott was proving more than equal to the task. In fact, his exuberance and willingness were causing him to become a valued and respected member of the team. Drew had gleaned a reasonable resume of Scott's background from Theodore Hunter, the gallery curator. Of course, it was necessary for the police to give Theo a full account of Scott's background if he was to accept Scott as a part of the team. Theo hadn't seen any reason to hide the information from his colleagues, and Drew in turn had chatted about the situation over various mealtimes with Beth at home. Sometimes Beth's twin brother had also been party to the conversation and had given extra insight into the situation, as he was a detective chief inspector at Winsford Police HQ. What was obvious from all of these discussions was that Drew was becoming genuinely fond of Scott. According to Drew, Scott lived at Cherry Hill Court, a block of flats in one of the least salubrious areas on the edge of the Manchester city centre. What beats me is why they give these places such highfalutin names, Drew had said during one particular conversation. You'd think that it was a luxury apartment in the leafy groves of an exclusive collection of villas. Perhaps the architects or council officials think that naming these awful places like they do will have all of the residents aspiring to better things. Mind you, I think that Scott and his mother would like to try. I don't know if it's the few spoiling it for the many, or vice versa, but Scott fell in with the wrong crowd and ended up in trouble once too often. What were Scott's crimes? Asked Beth. He got caught creating impromptu works of urban art on buildings that weren't officially available for an artistic overhaul, said Drew. I know it's bad and it can look a mess, but at least it wasn't drugs or violent crime, said Beth. Actually, Scott's art is really good. It's in a particular urban style, but it's tasteful. You'd like it, Beth. He's got a 21st century take on William Morris. Not that Scott knows who William Morris was. Actually, he does know now, thanks to his time at the gallery. You can tell that he absolutely loves being there. He's so eager to learn, and it's quite humbling. The masterpieces that we take for granted and barely give a second glance, he gapes at in wide-eyed wonder. It almost feels wrong to tear him away to get his chores done. How lovely to hear a story with such a happy ending. Don't you wish it could always work out like that? Does he live on his own? He lives with his mum. I think she's had her hands full with him for some years. It's the same old story there, I fear. His dad isn't on the scene. I don't know if he left or if he died. Scott was too strong-willed and hot-headed to heed his mother's pleas when he started mixing in the wrong circles. Hopefully that's all in the past now. She must be thrilled to see him finally come to his senses. Scott brought his mum to meet everybody at the gallery the other day, and the dear lady practically wept as she wrung my hands to thank me for taking him on. I don't think she believed me when I said I genuinely liked the lad, and I was pleased to find a new friend in him. Such friendship was evident now as Drew and Scott sat sharing tea and biscuits. "These biscuits are delicious, Mrs. Williams. Did you make them?" asked Scott. "Who on earth is Mrs. Williams?" asked Drew. "It's Beth to you, young man, and yes, she did make them. Hand them over, they're my favourite." I realise that this may seem like an obvious question, but what on earth are you doing to the shed wall? Asked Beth. Scott looked startled, and Beth was surprised to realise that he was actually afraid that he was in trouble again. She hastily tempered her comment to reassure him. "Of course I can see that you and Drew are busy creating priceless art, but what are you painting, and why on the shed wall?" Drew came to Scott's rescue and explained. "Over these last weeks, Scott and I have been consulting each other as fellow artists. Not only has he an invaluable help to me when I'm cataloguing the Constable collection for storage, but he's also had many valid and helpful insights into my own artwork. Scott's colour rose as a blush blossomed from the collar of his shirt and set his cheeks on fire. I've seen some photographs of Scott's own branch of art, but a screenshot hardly does them justice. Now that the shed is clear, I thought it was the perfect canvas for him to show me what he can really do. He's been extremely patient with my initial efforts. An aerosol is much trickier than a paintbrush, it's harder than it looks. Do we need to increase the home insurance policy to cover the shed now? Asked Beth. I don't think so just yet. I'm not quite a Banksy, but I can hope, said Scott. For the full book of Artful Designs, available in paperback or as an ebook, follow the link in the cards in the description box or find details on my website at sharonbill.com. Thanks for listening.